It's been a great pleasure and a privilege to entertain Dr. Darin Davis since last night. I know he's a very gracious man because it took me 4 passes along University Parkway to find his motel last night, and he didn't seem to be at all derisive of that. So he's a gentleman in every respect. Dr. Darin Davis is assistant professor of Christian philosophy and ethics at the George W. Truett Theological Seminary and director of Baylor's Institute for Faith and Learning. He earned degrees from the University of Texas, Baylor University, and St. Louis University. His PhD is in philosophy. His written articles have appeared in the American Catholic, Philosophical Quarterly, Christian Reflection, and the Southern Journal of Philosophy. He's the editor and co-author of Educating for Wisdom in the 21st Century University from St. Augustine Press, and it's forthcoming, I understand. Is that still forthcoming? At Truett, he teaches courses in Christian ethics and Christian friendship. He also serves as a member of the graduate faculty of Baylor's philosophy department, and he was recognized with the Mortarboard Circle of Achievement Award in 2013. As director of Baylor's Institute for Faith and Learning since 2008, Dr. Davis oversees the Institute's numerous projects, the annual Baylor Symposium on Faith and Culture. I've had the privilege of attending that the last couple of years, and it is a monumental achievement in terms of the work that goes into it, but in the quality of thought. It's a very important place for people to come together who share common faith and values, and in an academic setting. It is a marvelous accomplishment every year. They also is the director of various faculty and staff development efforts for the university, programs for Baylor's undergraduate and graduate students, and the Bill and Roberta Bailey Family Lecture in Christian Ethics, and an annual medical ethics lecture for area healthcare professionals, and the publication of Christian Reflection, a series in faith and ethics. He is a native of Amarillo, Texas. He and his wife Brenda have 3 daughters, and he is the pastor of Blue Ridge Baptist Church in Falls County, Texas. And this congregation, interestingly, was founded in 1859 and has operated ever since. That's a long time ago, if you stop and think about that. I have heard Dr. Davis preach and teach, and I recommend him to you as a fine spokesman for the cause that we all believe in. Dr. Davis.
Richard, thank you so much for your kind hospitality and warm welcome, for your friendship over the years. So grateful for you and Emily, who are constant sorts of encouragement for us at Baylor. They have come for the last 2 years to our Baylor Symposium on Faith and Culture. We're always glad to have them there. Had terrific conversations with Alan and with Jane earlier today, who are leading your faculty center. And all of you who are faculty members and administrators, grateful for your presence, grateful for the Wheatley family and for their stewardship of good things that help edify places like Brigham Young University, and also edify places afar like Baylor. The talk I want to give today is titled Faith, Learning, and Educating for Wisdom. Colleges and universities like Brigham Young and Baylor share the aspiration to advance the cause of education in a way that is animated by religious faith. Very often this task is referred to as the commitment to faith and reason, or faith and intellect. Sometimes it's referred to as the integration of faith and learning. In this talk, I want to suggest another way to describe our common task. I do so not to overturn the time-honored ways of talking about the relationship between the tasks of learning and the deliverances of faith. I do so only to suggest that this aspiration is so challenging and so complex that there is no single way of describing it. Another way, one that is helpful, I hope, is to describe our common efforts as educating for wisdom. Even casual observers of American higher education recognize that the contemporary academy is in the midst of challenge and transformation. The cost of a college degree continues to increase by leaps and bounds as students and their parents assume enormous student loan debt. Not long ago, a college degree nearly guaranteed financial success and career stability. Those days seem over. Some people wonder if the days of traditional classroom teaching and learning are over as well. Sweeping technological change, especially online instruction, is now forcing colleges and universities to re-envision how course content can be offered to students. These are by no means the only signs that the academy is experiencing change and stress. Amid these developments, it's not clear what people expect colleges and universities to do in the first place. Should they be primarily devoted to preparing their graduates to enter the workforce? Should they, at the same time, advance research across the disciplines in ways that expand the frontiers of knowledge? Should they seek to transform the lives of their students intellectually, morally, and even spiritually, while preparing them for responsible citizenship and civic engagement? Should they also be the places where enthusiastic sports fans gather in grand arenas and stadiums to watch athletes pursue victory? The answer seems to be a resounding yes to all of these. But with so many competing expectations from so many constituencies, it's no wonder that the academy seems to be suffering an identity crisis, or perhaps something akin to cognitive dissonance. Perhaps some of the current challenges in higher education could be better navigated if some of these expectations were scrutinized and prioritized. This would require asking even more basic questions. A generation ago, it was generally believed that the essential purpose of a university education involved shaping the moral and intellectual character of students in ways that led them to live and do well over their entire lives. I take this to be what is intended by the phrase educating for wisdom. In the contemporary milieu of American higher education, however, such a claim will seem to some amusingly irrelevant. Still, others may have little idea of what wisdom actually is, perhaps confusing it with shrewdness or ingenuity. Perhaps it's just the fancy and beautiful rhetoric of mission statements. So before any proposal about educating for wisdom can receive serious consideration, careful thinking needs to be done about what wisdom is and how the pursuit of it might direct the aims of universities like Baylor and Brigham Young. Beyond this, there is a need to reflect upon the nature of the crisis experienced by the modern academy. My own sense is that the crisis is of a spiritual nature, that the university's very soul is in disarray. Wisdom is a complex notion that resists simple definition, but a good first step, especially in our context, is to recall how the ancient Greek tradition, particularly the philosophical works of Plato and Aristotle, understand wisdom, and how their conceptions of wisdom are embedded in larger accounts of human nature. The Greek tradition understands wisdom as a virtue, an excellence that enables one to strive for true flourishing or happiness. The Greek word for this is eudaimonia. Though Plato and Aristotle believe that humans are neither morally good nor bad by nature, they maintain that humans can become good by developing through habituation a second nature of virtue. Virtue becomes a stable part of one's character, not in an instant, but over time and through experience. The virtue of honesty, for example, comes from being truthful time and time again. Through the process of habituation, one becomes an honest person. The temperate person, through the use of reason, controls her desires consistently, not just every once in a while. Two preliminary points might be made regarding the relationship between virtue and education. First, one acknowledges that an education aimed towards wisdom or any other virtue is not quickly or easily achieved. Happiness, at least as the Greeks envisioned it, is to be judged over the course of an entire human life, not in individual acts or episodes. So the formation of virtue is quite literally the work of a lifetime, not a single semester or even a 4-year span in the university. At best, any attempt to educate for virtue is something like an initiation, a way of setting forth an itinerary that one will follow for the rest of one's life. Second, because happiness on this view is an all-encompassing notion of a life well lived, the formation of virtue is not easily accounted for in so-called learning outcomes, at least not the sort that can be measured with precision through assessment tools. As Aristotle explains near the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, we can only expect as much precision as the subject matter allows. But the lack of a measurement tool for virtue need not deter the effort to make it the fundamental goal of education. The most important components of an enduringly happy life, whether personally or socially considered, are qualitative rather than quantitative in nature, and so resist the kind of assessment that professional educational administrators often feel drawn to as a means of justification. So what kind of virtue is wisdom, and on what basis may we justify the pursuit of it? The ancient Greek tradition conceived of wisdom in two aspects, practical and theoretical. Practical wisdom involves knowing what to do, as well as how and when to do it, all in a way that is consistent with human flourishing. Navigating a difficult situation with a coworker, finding the best way to offer advice to a friend in distress, determining the best way to act courageously in a dangerous situation, all of these require practical wisdom. Practical wisdom is expressed in action. But practical wisdom depends first and foremost on one's right ability to see the circumstances one faces. There's no good way of knowing what, how, and when to act unless one can sensitively appreciate the context in which one will act. In this way, practical wisdom is necessary for the full expression of any of the other virtues. But the practically wise person not only has a well-tuned moral perception, she can also deliberate well about the best way to achieve the goal she sees as good. To achieve a certain goal, one needs both a conception of what is being pursued and an understanding of how best to achieve it. Accordingly, practical wisdom is aptly described as goal-directed reason, and it's required for any act of virtue whatsoever. It's important to remember that for Aristotle, practical wisdom was not just one among a long list of virtues. Instead, the practically wise person, the phronimos, is the norm and the standard of virtue. But seeing and deliberating and doing the right thing in a particular circumstance also involves grasping a more general understanding of what is good. This more general conception depends on one having theoretical wisdom. The Greek insight here is one that is this. It's that one cannot know what is best to do in a particular circumstance without knowing what is best most generally. In the Greek tradition, theoretical wisdom is described in a number of important texts. Consider, for instance, Book 7 of Plato's Republic in the allegory of the cave. Recall the lone cave dweller and how he's unshackled from chains of self-imposed ignorance and begins the long and painful ascension towards the ineffable form of the good, the source of all that is true and good and beautiful, being itself. Aristotle likewise describes a longing that all humans have for this more general kind of wisdom In his metaphysics, he expresses the yearning to know things at their most general level as the expression of a natural desire, a sense of wonder that all humans have. The particulars we know through the senses, as Aristotle says, do not tell us the why of anything. Yet we desire to know why. So we inquire into the cause of particular things, including ourselves. We seek to understand, to unify disparate elements of experience, to find meaning. This kind of inquiry is aimed ultimately at understanding the divine, which for Aristotle was an unmoved mover, the first cause of the universe. Theoretical wisdom, therefore, was an exercise of the most divine element in us towards the most divine object. As Aristotle puts it, we are to take on immortality as much as possible. This description of wisdom is something akin to a religious conversion. Again, wisdom is not just among many virtues, it's preeminent. Now, it's important to realize that the Greek understanding of practical and theoretical wisdom is grounded in a larger conception of human nature. Human beings are complex, both psychologically and physiologically. We desire things that keep us alive at a very fundamental level, like food and drink and sex, but we also desire power and honor and wealth and friendship and even knowledge. Our desires have to be rightly ordered, and so it's the role of reason to direct us toward our proper end, living and doing well over a complete human life. The ancients clearly placed supreme confidence in the power of reason. It alone was capable of ordering human action, of shaping human desire, of reflecting upon truth and beauty and goodness. Likewise, the ancients pointed the telos of human life internal to human life itself, not towards any eternal world. Oh, there may be an immortal world, the realm of the gods, the unmoved mover, the forms, but this is not where human happiness is ultimately pursued. If the Greeks were right, then there can be no more important task for education than to seek and cultivate wisdom, for wisdom is the virtue that helps orient humans towards true happiness. Question is this possible today? At first glance, it might appear that many colleges and universities are, in fact, educating their students for wisdom, practical wisdom, at least, through the myriad courses and programs in leadership studies and applied ethics that have cropped up, especially in the last 2 decades. Nested in the curricula of business schools, education departments, and other professional programs, these programs often promise to prepare students for ethical decision-making and problem-solving, civic engagement, global leadership. These aspirations doubtlessly require practical wisdom. They require us to know what to do in the particular case. These programs rarely describe themselves as forming students in wisdom per se. But despite admirable intentions, such initiatives, unless they are properly conceived, can actually undermine the cultivation of practical wisdom. One way such courses can be ill-conceived is to promise students techniques and skills and tools that they can use to achieve success in particular domains, particularly in their role as ethical leaders. Now, on its face, this may seem like an entirely noble aspiration. If students are preparing to confront the challenges inherent in a complex world, a good education should provide the necessary tools to take them along the way. But the bare mention of techniques and skills and tools is problematic. The sort of moral reflection that is part of practical wisdom is not a handy multi-purpose tool or a 5-step technique that can be applied to solve moral quandaries. Although virtues and skills are both developed through consistent practice, one can be skillful in any number of pursuits: fly fishing, wood carving, bronc riding, playing the stock market, and still be a crook, a liar, and a cheat. The point's this: virtues are about more than performing particular activities well. They are about being the right sort of person. This is the central reason that formation for any kind of virtue requires special attention, and why formation into practical wisdom cannot be like the assembly of a well-equipped toolkit. Virtues, unlike tools, are not the sort of things that can be taken up, used, and put away. They shape our entire way of living. Such toolkit courses in leadership and applied ethics proliferate because know-how questions dominate the psyche of the contemporary university. The engines of the modern university are churning briskly, producing mountains of research, readying students to enter the workforce, but the techniques and tools being refined and the knowledge being passed down to the next generation are rarely appraised up and against more general moral commitments. So we're learning a lot, but for the sake of what? These commitments can only themselves be understood through the pursuit of something akin to what the Greeks understood as theoretical wisdom. Indeed, if it has not entirely disappeared from the consciousness of contemporary higher education, theoretical wisdom is unquestionably in exile, found in rather failing health in the care of some philosophy departments. But even in philosophy departments, where one might find or one might expect to find the pursuit of fundamental questions in full bloom, hyperspecialization often gets in the way, as the projects of moral philosophers and epistemologists and metaphysicians seem to be not so much at cross purposes, but wholly unrelated, quite contrary to the vision of philosophy as practiced by Plato and Aristotle and others. I know this firsthand because I have some colleagues at Baylor for whom I almost need to get a translator to talk about our research interests, and they're in the same discipline, hyperspecialization. Indeed, the impoverishment of theoretical wisdom seems to go hand in glove with hyperspecialization. It's not just that scientists and scholars of the humanities don't talk much about higher order questions. It's just that scholars and teachers hardly speak to anyone outside their own disciplinary specialization. And it's hard to cultivate anything like wisdom under such conditions. The trickle-down effect is lamentable. The vision of a university education that students receive is largely utilitarian, consumerist, and fragmented. Precisely when there is more need than ever for a reconciliation of practical wisdom and theoretical wisdom, to model for a wider culture that wise action requires serious reflection on essential questions of meaning, and that such reflection cannot be reduced to sound bites. The university seems not at all able to lead in that regard. As a practical matter, of course, not all students should pursue advanced degrees in philosophy to become better formed in theoretical wisdom. Rather, colleges and universities need to attend to the ways that philosophical and theological questions pervade human experience and can be found at literally every turn in a student's education. What would it mean if more courses were taught in ways that encourage scholars and students to think outside the bounds of their own subject matter and in ways that attempted to integrate larger concerns shared among the disciplines? Or imagine if students received the message from their very first days on campus that they would be encouraged and indeed required to slow down, ask big questions about human life, read and discuss great texts that explore these questions among good teachers and other students, not because these endeavors would earn them a six-figure salary after graduation, but because it might orient their lives towards true happiness. An education that prizes wisdom would not necessarily lead to the expansion of philosophy departments or any other departments, but it would meaning that inherently philosophical questions would be vibrantly and realistically presented throughout the activities of a university education, and that there would be a sort of set of central concerns that no one seeking a good life could possibly avoid. It's lamentable that precisely this kind of education, so direly needed to help meet the most important needs of students in culture, is nearly non-existent in most institutions of higher learning these days. Now, the model of education for wisdom I have sketched so far is broadly in line with the kind of reform urged for so persuasively by secular humanists like Anthony Kronman in his book, The End of Education, and Andrew Delbanco. This conception of liberal education, the deep engagement with the fundamental questions of human meaning, would do much to counter the prevalent notion that a college education is primarily about preparing students to enter the workforce. As Delbanco writes, an American college is only true to itself when it opens its doors to all, rich, middling, and poor, who have the capacity to embrace the precious chance to think and reflect before life engulfs them. An education animated by the search for wisdom would extend the horizon and reach of students, initiating them into a lifelong pursuit of moral and intellectual excellence, helping them to make sense of who they are and who they should become. But there's a distinctive way that education pursued from the perspective of the Christian faith might seek and cultivate wisdom, and it's worthy of reflection as a promising model of learning that might serve as a counterweight to the prevailing trends in the modern academy. Indeed, given the way that Christian learning extends from the very foundation of the medieval universities at Paris and Salamanca to the establishment of American universities like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and to the present day at schools that are both diverse in size and aspiration and expression of faith commitment, a Christian understanding of liberal learning deserves special attention. Such an account of higher education will recognize not only practical and theoretical wisdom, as people like Kronman and Delbanco do, it will also seek a third kind of wisdom, theological or spiritual wisdom. Because of its very nature and because of the limits of human perception and language, any description of divinely ordered wisdom is bound to be incomplete. It would be helpful, however, to see how a broadly Christian conception of human nature and virtue differs from the view of the Greeks. The differences drawn very broadly here will reveal some of what is distinctive about spiritual wisdom. First, Christians hold a doctrine of creation for which the Greeks had no equivalent. The book of Genesis recounts that humans come into existence through the intentional creative act of God, the creator of heaven and earth. All other living creatures were created according to their kind, but God creates human beings in his own likeness and image and blesses them in a special way. But a Christian account of human nature also has a distinctive account of the end or goal of human life. The divine is not only the source of creation, it is also what all human beings ultimately seek as their telos, as the perfection of their nature. In the Gospel of John, Christ proclaims that he is the way, the truth, and the life. In the book of Revelation, Christ declares, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. Accordingly, for Christians, perfect happiness is not simply living and doing well in this life, but rather beatitudo, the personal union of human beings with the divine in the eternal life to come. The Christian account of creation and teleology has important implications for the confidence that can be placed in the powers of human reason. It's interesting that the very first question of Aquinas' Summa Theologica, Thomas speaks to this precise point. He explains that there should be a knowledge that is necessary for human salvation that is revealed by God instead of by reason. Philosophical science, as Aquinas terms it, powered by human intelligence, has a limit. About this, the ancients and Aquinas agree. But for the Greeks, human reason is, in the end, all that humans have. Though reason will be inevitably exhausted when it reaches the rarefied air of the divine, human beings in the end must accept that transcendence, construed as an escape from the clutches of the temporal world, is simply not to be. Yet Christians believe there is the hope of transcendence, not achieved by the rational capacities of the self, but rather offered as divine grace through Christ's resurrection. Accordingly, when Christians recognize the limits of human reason, they do not accept it with stoic-like resignation. Instead, Christians acknowledge that certain truths are necessarily, for the sake of our salvation, beyond reason, and therefore must be received as a divine gift. Indeed, the fact of human limitation transforms a Christian understanding of virtue and accordingly transforms a Christian understanding of wisdom. For the Greeks, human flourishing is to be pursued through sheer human effort, through the habituation of acquired virtue. But for Christians, true happiness, envisioned as beatitudo, is beyond the grasp of frail human beings. Yet the acceptance of human finitude does not lead to a fatalism regarding the human condition. Christians see divine grace as the singular means to achieve perfect happiness. Grace bridges the chasm between human nature as it is and human nature as it may become, transformed in the light of the wisdom of God. Divine wisdom is, in Aquinas' language, an infused virtue. God acting through humans, moving them towards the perfection of their nature. Christians thus recognize three forms of wisdom: practical, theoretical, and spiritual. The latter surpasses the first two because it issues forth from God. The Christian faith is deeply steeped, of course, in the wisdom tradition. Spiritual wisdom is commended throughout Scriptures, especially in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. The book of Proverbs, most notably, is a sustained message about the necessity of discerning and following the wisdom of God and how those who do will find happiness. Spiritual wisdom brings human beings a more distinct awareness of how God is not only manifest in all of creation, but also the particular ways that God calls each person to faithfulness. Such wisdom can never come from sheer intellectual effort alone, because it surpasses what can ever be grasped through the power of cognition. This is not to say that reason plays no role in the discernment of spiritual wisdom. Rather, grace perfects reason, revealing a transcendent source of guidance that outstrips the powers of human understanding. So what are some particular ways that spiritual wisdom might shape the teaching and learning of Christians? And this question is important for places like BYU and Baylor. First, an education that seeks and affirms spiritual wisdom should reveal connections and interdependence among the academic disciplines. While the contemporary academy is often described not as a university, but as a multiversity, where fragmentation abounds and the various disciplines lack a common tongue with which to speak to one another, Christians have a special reason to resist this trend. And it's not just because interdisciplinary research sounds cool or that interdisciplinary research is in vogue with grant offering institutions. There is a Christian reason, a theological reason that this is so. The reason that Christian teachers and scholars might realize relationships among their subjects is not simply a matter of referring to themselves as Christian economists or Christian sociologists or anything else. The reason is ontological in nature, built into the fabric of a Christian conception of reality. If divine wisdom is the very wellspring of all teaching and learning, that is, if God is the creative source of all goodness and truth and beauty, then each academic discipline and each scholar working within that discipline, as it seeks to discover what's that source of truth, will in some way find relation to other lines of inquiry that seek the same end. In this way, scholarly teaching and learning, no matter its point of departure, will reveal an aspect of the divine. For example, A colleague of mine at Baylor in electrical engineering frequently teaches a course on solar energy, and he does so in an especially interesting way. Besides teaching principles and applications in electrical engineering, the sort of thing I could never understand, he also encourages students to reflect philosophically, theologically, and biblically about matters involving God's creation, human consumption, conservation, and more important, Christian views of stewardship. This in a solar energy course. These questions seek engagement with other academic disciplines, including theology, philosophy, economics, environmental study. I want to say that a Christian conception of learning that seeks spiritual wisdom as its goal may show not only how seemingly disparate disciplines are related, it can also reveal how disciplines actually depend upon one another. It's not just that they're related, it's that we depend upon one another. If you have this Christian conception of the way in which the world and creation hang together. Further, on a Christian view, the pursuit and cultivation of spiritual wisdom should be marked by charity, understood as caritas here, not simply almsgiving, but the classical sense of the love of God and the love of neighbor. Now, to some, this may sound like a rhetorical flourish or some kind of hopelessly naive aspiration, especially in the context of contemporary higher education. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of love sometimes. But for Christians, educating for spiritual wisdom through the various activities of teaching and learning and research and scholarship is a fundamentally profound expression of love for God and neighbor. It is out of God's providential love that humans are created. It is because of God's love that he calls humans to genuine happiness, to the perfection of their nature. Seeking and receiving spiritual wisdom is precisely what God made humans to do. To understand, however incompletely, the love of God and the way God calls his creatures to faithfulness. Likewise, those who educate for the sake of spiritual wisdom will see others, teachers, students, colleagues, co-investigators, as fellow lovers of truth, created also to seek and understand God's wisdom. Undoubtedly, the ways that charity might inspire the aims of education could be countercultural. Both the subject matter of one's study and one's intellectual collaborators and even one's intellectual opponents would be objects of love, worthy of searching attention and care. Teaching and learning would be more akin to prayer and worship and less like efforts to eviscerate an intellectual opponent or to master a particular body of knowledge for the sake of self. Christian universities need to model more than ever what it would be to be a winsome witness, to be a profound expression of charity. Spiritual wisdom seems to be very much at the heart of that. Third, an education animated by spiritual wisdom can encourage in teachers and learners a profound sense of awe and humility. The very recognition of a creative source of truth, goodness, and beauty that stands independent of time, place, and circumstance puts human intelligence and its limits in proper perspective. Humans are prone to all kinds of failures of perception and misunderstanding and plain and simple error. We simply don't know everything. Beyond the intellectual mistakes that abound, moral and spiritual vice can cloud efforts to realize what is true and best. But the awareness of human fallibility need not lead us to despair. For Christians, human imperfection instead provokes a sense of awe, understood as that remarkable mix of fear and wonder and reverence experienced when one acknowledges something truly real, powerful, and beautiful beyond oneself. It is through this recognition of the divine that awe begets humility as one comes to realize the proper relationship between oneself, others, and God. Finally, many Christian humanists share the same concerns about American higher education as secular humanists like Cronman and Del Banco. While the general diagnosis of the problem is largely the same, their views diverge about the nature of the prescription. Secular humanists and Christian humanists may well agree that the best remedy is wisdom, but they likely will part company once they begin to explore the various ways of understanding what wisdom really is. These differences are likely to grow out of distinct conceptions of what it is to be human. And no theory of education can be neutral about such matters. For all that, there is good reason for secular humanists and Christian humanists to engage in rigorous argument about questions concerning the views of human nature and the aims of education. But there's also good reason to believe that American higher education is presently in such precarious predicament that secular humanists and Christians also should acknowledge the commitments they hold in common and join forces as it is possible for the sake of recovering the university's sense of its most noble calling. The modern university both shapes and is shaped by the larger culture, by long-held practices and fleeting trends. This is important to consider when reflecting upon the university's present condition. To say that the modern academy is suffering something akin to an identity crisis, that it has neglected or altogether forgotten its most essential purpose, is to draw attention to the existence of a larger cultural malaise. Put simply, if the university is in disorder, then it is reflective of a similar condition in the culture. In closing, and very briefly, another way of describing the identity crisis in the modern academy is simply this: it cares about the wrong things. It pursues goals that belie its essential mission. It has its priorities out of order. Moreover, it seems distracted, moving in so many directions, trying to fulfill the wants and desires of so many competing constituencies that it does not have a grounded sense of its responsibility to educate for wisdom. The very soul of the university is compromised and undergoing a spiritual crisis. Among the traditional 7 deadly sins in the Christian tradition is acedia, often taken to be laziness or sloth. Acedia literally means to be without care, to be infused with an apathy and indifference rooted in the conviction that nothing really matters. Opposed to the virtue of magnanimity, being great-souled, acedia is giving up the conviction that anything truly noble is worth pursuing. It is a spiritual malaise that saps one's sense of hope. The good, the true, the beautiful, whatever's excellent, well, they're seen as simply too high to attain. Rhetorical flourishes without purpose. So those who have succumbed to acedia turn away from what is best and noble and try to busy themselves in pursuing counterfeit goods. They are drawn especially to distraction by trivial things, wastes of time and energy that are not conducive to authentic happiness. Those with acedia seek whatever they can imagine or hope will take their minds off what they have come to perceive as the hopelessness of their task. It's a means of coping, a way of settling for much less than they were meant to be, but also the recipe for suffering a true identity crisis. Acedia is the general condition of much of university culture and to destructive effect. The category of acedia is by itself insufficient to account for the state of the contemporary university, much less to the larger culture. Yet it is worth considering that in the midst of the talk of the crisis in higher education, that the nature of its disorder is likely far more complicated than it might first appear. No new technique, no strategy, no additional assessment measurement is likely to address the pressing challenges the modern academy faces. Determining the way forward will require wisdom. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take some questions. I'm sorry to end on a note of acedia, but the great cure of acedia is hope, and we hope we find hope in our midst. But I do think we have to look clear-sighted about American higher education, and institutions like BYU and Baylor are not insulated. Not at all. So I hope some of those things and this notion of educating for wisdom is a slightly different category or a different way of thinking about things that you're already committed to and might be a help in the days ahead. So what questions or comments do you have? Yes? Do we want to come down to them?
We always try if they can from mine.
I can try and speak loudly. Is that good enough?
Yes, that's fine.
My name is Cynthia Cannell,
Hi, Cynthia.
and the freshman students of this year's class were my students last year. And I resigned my position in teaching because I could no longer in my classroom teach anything that had parameters of this is right and this is wrong. I was not allowed to teach anything that had any Western references. I was not allowed to teach anything that could be perceived as chauvinistic. So most of the things that you shared with us from Plato, Aristotle, would not even be put on the table for discussion. What I did do in order to complete my responsibilities was to study Confucianism, because I found that those who were resistive of Western philosophy were willing to accept the very same teachings from the East. Do you have any suggestions on what we can do in helping our students before they arrive at the university?
To help students before they get here. Yeah, several things. One thing that is so important is I think that parents and high school counselors and everyone who has sort of care and concern for young people before they come to university, my hope is that they would want to encourage them to come to the university for the right sorts of reasons. Not just as a natural progression of things just to follow high school, but a kind of preparation for living well no matter what your job or occupation will be. So often I think we just gear people up to decide that coming to the university is about credentialing or networking or job training. And it's certainly the case that we would want our graduates to have good jobs, meaningful work, but isn't the most important thing to prepare them to live well independent of their first job? I mean, isn't it the case that they may change what their jobs or positions or occupations are several times, but the more fundamental question about how to initiate them into lives that are well-led, a service to God and to others, wouldn't that be the kind of fundamental thing that we would hope that a university would do? So I think there's a lot of programming that has to be done. I mean, not sort of computer programming, but in messaging really what we hope universities are fundamentally about. That's one of the things that I think we're up against at a place like Baylor, which is that, people come with a variety of expectations about what the experience is going to be for them. We understand that, but variety of expectations about fundamental matters, like why am I here? I'm here to get credentialed. I'm here to fit in well. I'm here to become a part of a sorority or a fraternity, or to watch Baylor on Saturday play football. And we have to enlarge in people's imaginations about what a university education is about. And I think that starts very early in the kind of messaging and hopefulness that we would have as we encourage people to come to places like BYU and Baylor and elsewhere.
I'm kind of jumping the gun here because I get to interview you, I think, tomorrow for radio here at BYU.
Terrific.
My name's Marcus Smith.
Hey.
I can't speak for everybody, but I kind of feel like you're probably preaching to the choir. And that's good. But my mind went back to being a freshman here in 1979. I was taking a weightlifting class. And we were paired, so somebody could spot me. And so just randomly, here I am with some kid, and never met him before. What's your major? Where are you from? That kind of stuff. And I said, well, I'm in German. And he says, well, where do you start? And I said, well, there's grammar, and there's declensions, and there's all of the vocabulary. He said, well, I'm a pre-med, and I'm going to start at 80,000. And I've thought about that so many times, because coming to BYU, I got the real clear impression that we were not here as students, and I don't know why I got this. Maybe it was because I was a German major and I wasn't a pre-med student. But I got the impression that the kind of experience I was about to have at a university was like you're describing, or was calculated to be something that would situate me in the cosmos, not just in a job. That was 1979, and here it is all these years later, and I don't despair of where the students are coming from, when they enter the university as consumers, sometimes as pretty crass consumers. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about, you just mentioned programming people before they come here so that they know what the institution is supposed to do for them. But what if they enter so steeped in the culture, the general broader culture of America, that they don't know that you can't serve both God and mammon, and they're here to become servants of mammon as they perceive it because they want jobs, they want the money, they're going for the success, they're looking for the certification. How do you convert them? How do you bring them around to seeing something bigger in the role of a university?
I have to challenge their notion about what success is. I have to challenge their notion about what happiness is. I appreciate that I'm preaching to the choir. That's a good thing. I actually don't have a choir at my church, so I'm really happy to preach to one. But I guess I don't think we want to assume too much about the cultural forces that are responsible for the ways in which our students and their parents understand why they come to university, but also the ways in which we ourselves as scholars and teachers within the academy are so conditioned by the expectations of the guild. So our allegiances are not always first and foremost to the university and its mission, but to the rewards and the conditions of success professionally as English scholar, philosopher, engineer, academic administrator. And the guilds, there are Christian guilds, but the guild itself is rather secular. And the expectations of it are rather prone to reward and expect things that are pretty counter to what I was trying to articulate with respect to educating for wisdom. So that's to say, we can talk a lot about what students, how they have to be programmed, but we ourselves as faculty and those who engage with students have to have a clear conscience about what our lives of service and meaning and purpose are, and academic administrators and presidents or provosts have to be able to reward that and expect it, and have the idea that our institutions like BYU and Baylor are going to buck the trends in some ways with respect to what we would want faculty to do and what success looks like, both as a student and as a faculty member and as someone who's engaged in student life and all the rest. So it's a long conversation. We'll talk more about it in the morning. Other questions or comments?
Okay, I'm a student here at BYU.
Yes, sir. Tell me your
And
name.
Mitchell Larson.
Hey, Mitchell.
And one thing I notice, I guess, is a lot of students have this mentality of just passing a test or passing, just getting a good grade, and that's kind of their motivation. So as a student, what advice would you give, I guess, to be able to develop this perspective of motivation of seeking wisdom?
Okay. Great question. I'm going to speak to you. I don't have a son, so I'll speak to you sort of rather fraternally for a minute, okay? I would want for you that your education opens up your horizons and your imagination far beyond the 4 years that you're here. I would also want to show you that learning is the fundamental task of the university, being formed in wisdom. There are lots of ways in which you learn and are challenged that will never show up on your transcript. The most life-giving and challenging and spiritually forming experience I ever had was taking Spanish for 2 years at Amarillo College before I transferred to the University of Texas, because it taught me that there were limits to what I could know, and I had a professor who really challenged me in incredibly important ways. She was a giver of both judgment and grace. She was someone who, when I took Spanish exams, this is the way in which the grades would be on the exam. It wouldn't be an A or a B or a C or even like a 78 or a 79. I got lots of C's, okay? This is the point of the story. I would get things like 78.7535. I mean, she had the system worked out. And that showed me all sorts of things about myself. One, that earning C's could be good for me. I hope you don't earn C's, but I learned a lot from earning C's at the time, because I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about what learning would require of me. I learned a lot about what docility is, which is to be teachable. Didn't really have that because I'd never been pressed. And I also learned from her this expectation of excellence and a kind of care and concern for the subject matter and for her students. I hope you get a whiff of that here at BYU, that you're around people who love the right things and they show you how to love the right things, and you come to love the right sorts of things. And that lasts your whole life. That lasts your whole life. And that's so much more important than any grade that you can get on any exam or any course. And there are a whole lot of people who've been educated really well and served really well by the academy who never graduated with honors. And there are a lot of people who graduated with honors who learned very little at the university. So I would say, fraternally, I want you to learn a lot. I want you to learn about yourself and who God is and who God calls you to be. Yes?
Can I just ask a question here?
Yes?
I'm a student here. My name's Mike Morgan.
Hey, Mike, how are you?
Good. I'm a philosophy major and really enjoying it. And my parents were a little concerned when I switched from pre-accounting to philosophy.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, they kind of have helped me out a little bit with school, and how can I help them see the same perspective that you have?
Well, hey, this is the challenge of going home at Christmas. I got this for years. I'd go home, and I'm from Amarillo, Texas, and I can tell you, going home, there were not a lot of people who were coming home as philosophy majors, and so I always got, there are a lot of people going to get ag degrees and we're doing finance and things like that. And so I always got the question, so what are you majoring in? And I'd say philosophy. It was even worse when I was in graduate school because they knew I was serious about it. And they would say, what are you going to do with that? And, what I finally ended up telling them in following this is I'm confident that if I do what I love, and that if that's generally the way I'd put it, if I do what I love, the job will take care of itself. And I fundamentally believe that if you do what you love, and if you set your passions as God gives them to you towards the right aim, then you have to have some faith that things will work out. Whether or not you'll end up going to graduate school and getting a PhD and teaching in a place like Brigham Young, maybe you will. That would be terrific. Maybe there are all sorts of ways in which liberal learning and asking big questions and learning how to articulate those well and write well and think well will be a blessing to all sorts of people, both in and out of the church. You can send them my email and I'll try to help you out on that. That's a great question, though. Yes, sir.
Stephen Giltz. I'm in chemistry. I've got a colleague right here in engineering.
Larry, yeah.
I think most people view those fields as pretty aseptic. But as I get into science, I find it to be deeply profound and
Yes.
provocative to think about much more than just what way people think of things.
Yeah.
And there are certainly students that have the attitude of, I don't want to understand why, I just want to know what equation to use.
Right.
But it's not just here at BYU where I felt that.
No.
The scientists I know and engineers I know from all around the world, they are, they think deeply about life. So I'm wondering if you can help me and think about what you are envisioning would be teaching wisdom as part of chemistry or engineering or physics or math, because it seems to me that it's viewed in that. So I need some help in understanding where you think we've gone wrong.
Well, I don't necessarily think that you have gone wrong or the field of chemistry has. I think the only thing that I would want to say is that when disciplines are taught simply in a sort of how-to kind of way, without these connections among the disciplines, without asking the bigger questions about the why, they're not forming in us or in our students wisdom. One of the things I'd love to see, I don't really want to speak particularly to chemistry because I don't think I could do that, but one of the visions I would hope for a place like BYU is the way in which fields at some distance from one another on a disciplinary range could actually take up research projects or teaching courses and do those collaboratively. What are the fields in which chemistry intersects naturally? Who are your conversation partners in other disciplines here?
Well, I've had the opportunity actually this is something that I think is somewhat unusual about BYU.
Yeah.
Teaching seminars that involve people from language and from the humanities.
Tell me what a course like that looks like. I'm interested to know. This will be helpful stuff for me to take back to Baylor.
We each bring our own, from our own disciplines, perspectives on particular topics, and so we can look at it from a variety of angles. By the way, I hope my question didn't sound hostile.
No. So is this is a course in the curriculum?
Yes, they have various, this is usually through honors, but they have specialty symposium and so forth.
Yeah, that's rare, and I think more of that, I would encourage more of that to be done. We don't get to do a lot of that at Baylor. I wish we were able to do more of it, but there is such this powerful force of specialization such that chemists talk to chemists and maybe they talk to some physicists and You know, maybe they get together and maybe some engineers, and maybe they get together and talk about, pre-health education or something like that. But there's very little in the way in which we can talk about matters of pedagogy, which I think map across all the disciplines, and then matters of sort of concrete scholarly questions that can be brought to fruitful exchange. And so if you're doing that, I think you should continue to do more of that and message to your administrators, your department chairs, your deans, how important and how valuable that is to both for you and for your students to kind of model what we hope, educating for wisdom would be, which is not a kind of narrow specialization, but sort of broad imagination about the ways in which particular disciplines can shine a light on the truth. Yes, sir.
I'm not blessed with a very loud voice, so I'll come down. My name's Michael, and I'm one of those electrical engineering faculty.
Great.
So I kind of interpret your message as seek wisdom while you're a student at the university. Seek wisdom, and the rest will take care of itself. And it reminds me of Jesus' words on a Sermon on the Mount, seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you. And I was wondering if that was maybe one of those ways where the Christian ethic or the Christian version of wisdom maybe expands itself into other kinds of wisdom. So I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Help me, I'm sorry, before you step away, help me understand your question a little bit more.
So I'm sure you're familiar with Jesus. You're being a minister, right?
I've heard of Jesus.
Yeah.
I've even heard of the Sermon on the Mount.
I think I was there that day we had him in class. This idea from the Sermon on the Mount of, seek what's important and all the other things you need to live and make your way in the world will take care of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think we often think about it as sort of not getting lost in the minutiae of daily life. But it can also be thought of as, doing what's important and just having the faith or the hope that things will take. And then I kind of, I hear your message of, well, seek wisdom. I think your advice to the philosophy major up here was along those lines. Just seek to become an educated person. And, the job and how you make your living will all take care of itself.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you saw the parallels there.
I do. That's very helpful. The Christian conception of wisdom realizes the limits of reason and the limits of human effort and the ways in which human effort has to be made, but that in doing that and walking that faithfully, that there's a hope that we're walking towards. I mean, that would be the part 2 of the paper, which is to say that if we do live in a culture in which a lot of people seem to have something like acedia or giving up or spiritual apathy, when this talk of doing the great things, the wildly imaginative things, people say, oh, we can't do that anymore. We can't do that politically. We can't do that socially. I said, well, yeah, it's not that we seek optimism as Christians, but that we need hope. Optimism comes and goes. Optimism ebbs and flows just like the stock market. The assurance of the gospel message offered by Jesus in word and life and sacrifice, it points us toward the cross. And so our faithfulness as Christians is the ways in which by walking as Christ would have us walk, then by doing what we love and doing it faithfully, things really will ultimately take care of themselves in as much as Christ will take care of us. So I hope that's part of what educating for wisdom in a Christian context helps us to see. Thank you for your question. It's very good.